Hello, welcome to this Angular tutorial series. If you are learning Angular in 2026, you may notice that many tutorials still teach old practices or old approaches that no longer represent modern Angular development. Well, that has changed, or Angular has changed quite significantly. With the introduction of modern features, improved reactivity, and a cleaner architecture pattern, Angular application today looks very different from those built a few years ago. In this course, you will go step by step from beginner to intermediate, learning Angular the right way, using current best practice and real-world pattern you may apply immediately. By the end of this tutorial, you will have a strong foundation to confidently build a scalable and a more modern Angular application. Well, most old Angular tutorials begin by introducing concepts such as Angular modules everywhere, directives such as ngIfs and ngFor, heavy RJX usage, complicated folder structures, and a large amount of boilerplate before you even understand anything. This approach often makes Angular feels a bit more complicated, overwhelming, and difficult to learn. But modern Angular doesn't work like that anymore. Many developers don't struggle because Angular is so hard, but they are taught too many things too early without understanding the concept. Now, over a period of time, Angular has evolved. With Angular 20 or 20 plus, the focus is no longer on adding complexity, it's on removing it. Today, Angular is intentionally designed to be simpler, more predictable, and easier to reason about. Now, at the center of modern Angular are standalone components. Components are no longer depend on large module structure to exist. Each component is self-contained, explicit, and easy to understand, which immediately makes application easier to scale and maintain. Then we also have got signals, which brings a much clearer model of reactivity. Instead of guessing when change detection runs or how data flows, signals make state change explicit and predictable. You can see how data moves through the application. Angular also introduces modern control flow, things like if, for, and switch. These are not just syntax improvement, they reduce mental overhead, remove boilerplates, and make template read more like plain logic instead of framework magic. All of this is supported by a cleaner dependency injection and a simpler overall architecture, which gives fewer layers, fewer interaction, and clear responsibilities. The result is a clearer data flow, which makes application easier to understand, easier to debug, and easier to scale. In this tutorial, we are deliberately focusing on how Angular works today, not how it worked a few years ago. That is a distinction which matters the most. A lot of Angular confusion comes from learning outdated mental models, such as modules first, heavy configuration, and complex wiring. That's not how modern Angular thinks anymore. Instead, you will learn concept in the right order, which is first why something exists, then how it fits into a bigger picture, and only then we will learn how to use it. This approach makes Angular feels a little bit more structured, predictable, and approachable, instead of the overwhelming or confusion. Now, Angular didn't just change the syntax. You will see that it changed the way you think about building an application. Okay, so let's take a step back and look at where every Angular application actually begins. At the heart of modern Angular application, there's a single line of code that is bootstrap application or app component. This line actually tells Angular that life has just begun. Now, with this line, it tells us that the application has just begun using this component, There is no module involved here, no complex configuration, no large setup of files to understand before anything else works. Angular starts with one component. This is the root component, and everything else grows from this root component. Once Angular bootstraps this component, it begins by building the entire application around it. It creates such things as the component trees. It sets up the dependency injection. It loads routes. It renders the UI, and all starting from that single root. That is a very important shift in how Angular works today. In older versions, modules were treated as the center of the application, but modern Angular no longer thinks that way. Today, components are the true building blocks of Angular. They don't just represent pieces of UI. They define structure, they define behavior, they define responsibility. When you understand that Angular grows outward from one root component, the framework becomes much easier to reason about. Instead of thinking in terms of configuration and wiring, you start thinking in terms of components, how they connect, how they communicate, and how the application flows. And once that mental model clicks, Angular starts to feel far more intuitive. Okay, now that we understand where Angular starts, let's talk about what is a component. At its core, a component is simply a piece of user interface. It has its own template, which defines what you see on the screen, its own logic, which controls how the UI behaves. You can think of a component as a small self-contained part of the screen that manages its own states and responsibility. For example, a button can be a component, a form can be a component, a list, a panel, a sidebar. All these can be components. Rather than build one large page with everything inside, Angular encourages you to break the interface down into smaller manageable pieces. Each component does its own job, and it does it well. Modern Angular, especially from version 16 going onwards, strongly promotes this approach. Instead of massive components with hundreds and hundreds of lines of code, the goal is clarity, separation of consent, and usability. When components are small and focused, they become much easier to understand, much easier to test, and much easier to maintain. Okay, so now let's talk about how data actually flows or moves inside an Angular application. Angular follows a one-way data flow, which means data flows in a clear and predictable direction, where we have got a parent component that passes data down to its children, and a child component which communicates back to the parent by emitting events upwards. And when there is a change in state, or when a state changes, the UI updates to reflect that change. Nothing happens automatically behind the scenes. If something changes on the screen, it's because something explicitly triggered it to do so. This is one of the most important ideas to understand in early Angular development. Because when data flows in one direction, application becomes easier to reason about, easier to debug, and far more stable as they grow. You never have to guess where a value comes from, or where a value is coming from, or why the UI has just changed, or why the UI changed. The path is always visible. And while this might feel strict at first, it is actually what allows Angular application to scale confidently. Once you understand this flow, many of the confusing part of Angular simply disappears, and learning it becomes much easier, and it saves you months and months of frustration later on. Okay, so one of the key features which you introduced in Angular version 20 plus are signals. Before signal existed, Angular relied heavily on traditional change detection and RxJS to manage reactivity. While that approach worked, it wasn't always friendly for beginners. A lot of things happened behind the scenes, and it wasn't obvious why the UI has just updated or why it didn't update. The introduction of signals brings a much simpler way to think about reactivity. With signals, when a value changes, Angular knows exactly what depends on that value. And only that specific part of the user interface updates, meaning that there is no guessing, no unnecessary re-rendering, no hidden behavior. Reactivity becomes explicit and predictable. Because of this, signals are now a core concept in modern Angular, and we will be building on them throughout this entire series. You don't need to master everything at once, but you need to understand what signals represents. That is a clear relationship between the state and the UI. This will give or will make everything that follows easier to learn. Now, the biggest myth is that will signals replace RxJS? I would say that would be completely false. Now, the vision that the Angular team had when they brought in signals were that signals are for state and RxJS for asynchronous logic.